Welcome to the 13th episode of June 2020 of the Magical Elections podcast about astrology and magic. My name is Nina Griffin, and I'm a traditional astrologer and magician. This podcast is where I discuss astrological magic, favorable magical elections, and host an informal exploration of the traditional magical arts with other magicians as well as those who are magic adjacent. You can find previous episodes on your favorite podcasting platforms, such as the Apple Podcasting app. You can also visit my website, ninagriffin.com, to find previous episodes. You can also find articles there about astrology and magic. The video version of this podcast will be available at youtube.com/ninagriffin, where you can subscribe to get notified of future episodes, so you have your choice of an audio or video version. What are magical elections? Many historic magical texts suggest that magical results are enhanced by astrologically electing the moment when the desired magical energies are at their height and performing the magical ritual at that time. In my experience, this is very much the case. However, most astrologers are not magicians, and most magicians are not astrologers. This is where I come in. Every month, I select a few auspicious dates and times and also recommend traditional materials for you to use for maximum magical potency. It also includes the names of angels and spirits that should be invoked and the magical images associated with each talisman. Since earlier this year, magical elections have included talismanic images created by Minkyu Lee, a professional animator, filmmaker, and artist. I also include suggestions for further reading and learning, and a magical lesson on a different topic each month. This is all included in the monthly Magical Elections PDF, which you can buy at ninagriffin.com for $15. Today, we will discuss the contents of the June issue of Magical Elections, and I'll tell you about a sample-free magical election that you can use that will be in June. This month, I interviewed Minkyu Lee, who is the Oscar-nominated animator that's been illustrating magical elections. In this interview, Minkyu and I talk about art, astrology, and magic and the way that they intersect. The June issue of the Magical Elections PDF is now available at ninagriffin.com, and I identified 5 elections for June. The first is the second decan of Pisces, which is for safe travel, success away from home, and success in spiritual pursuits. The first decan of Cancer is used for enchantment, attraction, and verbal artistry. The 12th lunar mansion is for increasing a harvest, especially good for those of us who have gardens, and the prospering of plants, as well as strengthening the loyalty of our allies and supporters. There's also a wonderful fixed star talisman for the Royal Fixed Star Regulus, the heart of the lion. And this one is used for alleviating the melancholic humor, for receiving favor and honors, strengthening one's health and vitality, and also lessening anger, our own as well as that of others. Finally, there is the 10th lunar mansion talisman, which is particularly good this month for lessening anxiety and fear. As in every issue, you can read about the astrological wall of shame, which includes upcoming elections that may look good, but don't quite make the grade. This is helpful if you do your own electing and want to check your work, but also if you've ever purchased pre-made talismans and are concerned those elections are not optimal. It's a good educational tool because it shows you the kinds of things that can damage otherwise favorable electional charts. Before we get to the interview, Minkyu created 2 images that are included in this month's magical elections. One is for the 12th lunar mansion, while the other is for the second decan of Pisces. These are black and white talismanic images for you to print out and use in your magical works, whether you trace the image during your ritual or you want to color it in. If you ever want to use an image for a future election that's from a previous issue, let me know and I can sell you the back issue. Just contact me at nina@ninagriffin.com via email. The free election for June is the second decan of Pisces talisman, which relies on Mars transiting the second decan of Pisces. Minkyu created a truly beautiful image this month. It's something you can use for safe travel, success far from home, and success in your spiritual pursuits. The election is set for June 3rd, 2020, 6:55 to 7:24 a.m. in Los Angeles, California. So you'll want to start your ritual during this window. You will want to start out with 0 Cancer on the ascendant in your location for the beginning of the selection, but be sure to keep an eye on the moon and ensure that her next applying aspect is a trine to Mars. The incense to use in your ritual, according to the traditional sources, will be related to Mars. So you'll want spicy substances like garlic or pepper, though make sure you don't get too close to those fumes and have good ventilation because they can be very powerful. The name of the spirit of the Deccan does not appear in our surviving ancient Egyptian texts, but we can invoke the angels and spirits of Mars. And these are Zamael, Graphiel, and Bartabel. The image for this talisman, which Minkyu made so beautifully, it represents a woman with color more beautiful than the champaka. The champaka is a magnolia tree with white or golden blossoms, so it's referring to the color of the blossoms. She is surrounded by her attendants and sailing in a boat decked with long flags in search of the coast of the ocean. My recommendation for this talisman is that you can do a stone or metal talisman, and you could do iron or steel since those are metals of Mars, or you could do a verbal petition or a paper talisman as well. As I always emphasize, the talismanic image is extremely important because images act directly on the soul without the intermediation of words. You would also want to write or engrave the goal that you want on your talisman as well as your name. Now let's turn to the interview with Minkyu. We did an audio interview, so I will put up a video card during this portion of the podcast. Welcome everyone. This is Nina Griffin, and today I have the great pleasure and honor of hosting Minkyu Lee, who is an Oscar-nominated animator and artist. Minkyu has worked on such projects as Frozen and Moana, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful artist. I encourage you to visit him on Instagram, where he has many examples of his wonderful art. So Minkyu, the way that I have sort of connected with him is that Minkyu very kindly has offered to draw talismanic images for my monthly Magical Elections issue. And if you would like to see some of the wonderful images he came up with, you can look at issues starting with March 2020. And so in every issue, there are 2 or 3 images that Minkyu has created. Welcome, Minkyu. Thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Hello, Nina. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
All right. So I'm going to ask you some questions. I think you're a really interesting person in the sense of you are both a professional and extremely highly rated artist, but also you are a fan and practitioner of astrology and perhaps more recently astrological magic. So I'd be very interested. Maybe let's start at the beginning. And
Okay.
maybe if you can tell me a little bit about your journey to astrology, because as I understand it, you got into it as an adult. So it's not something that's been with you forever and ever.
Yeah, not really. I think I've always had like a peripheral interest in astrology and was curious about like the mechanism of it, but never really got into it until I think it's like several years ago. I was going through, interestingly enough, an artistically kind of challenging time internally. And I was just kind of trying these different workshops, and Channy Nicholas's actually workshop kind of came into my vision, and I started trying it out. And the first one that I did, I remember just being really astonished by the accuracy. I mean, I think Channy is just she's such a good astrologer. She's so knowledgeable, and she has a way of distilling the information that is really easy to understand. And it really helped me a lot. It kind of framed what was going in my life in a way that was not only accurate but very like it kind of made the suffering kind of all okay in an odd sense. But I have a Virgo moon, and so for me, like, I don't easily just accept it. I have to kind of like pick it apart a little bit and like, really try to lift the curtain and be like, okay, how does this really work though? And does this really work? And is this just me, making the connections in my head. And so I started doing those workshops one after another. And not only for me, but I started, to collect my friends' charts, and without telling them, kind of, this is a very stereotype thing, but just kind of like seeing, if, for example, if I have Cancer rising friends, like, okay, what's happening in the Cancer rising world, and just kind of seeing if that's also happening to my friends. And it definitely, I think, after like a year of that kind of experiment, I think that really helped me erase a lot of my doubts in my mind, where I was like, okay, this feels pretty unmistakable and undeniable, because what's going on in their life is definitely not happening to me. So it's not like you can just apply some, because I think skeptics of astrology sometimes can tend to say that, like, it's just you're making your own connections. So that kind of led me into wanting to, discover what astrology is. And on the way, I think I just discovered what the beauty of astrology is, with the symbolism. And, it is in some ways, a very poetic, creative art form. And I think that speaks to kind of my artist soul. And yeah, I think that was the start of it. And then I started really getting into it, and I started taking classes under Achyuta Bhava, and I met you, and yeah, so the rest is history, I guess.
That's right. So it sounds like you kind of came to it from a perspective of wanting more self-understanding, right? Like you wanted to understand whether what was happening to you, like what did it
Yes,
mean? Was there maybe some other way to look at this probably difficult period in your life?
totally. Yeah, it was just a way of, I didn't expect that it would be this way, but in the end, it became this way of like framing what was going on in my life in a much larger perspective, and even potentially talking about the purpose of what's going on in my life,
That's
and
right.
yeah, and so it was really, really helpful in that way.
Yeah, I mean, that really reminds me of a lot of writings that you see even outside the astrological world, where if you're going through a difficult period in your life, as long as you can give it some meaning and, as you just said, some purpose, it can completely change that narrative about what's happening and can give you a lot of courage and strength and, just again, a more positive view on what's happening. It sounds like
Mhm.
that's what happened for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was like the first hook of it, and then I think what's also really seductive about astrology too is that, it is a hermetic art form. So that, Hermes being Mercury, like, it is a very
Yes.
slippery art form. It's like the more you think you get it, the more it like slips away, and it's like,
Yes.
no, there's
That's
so much
right.
more. And then so I think what's so perfect is, like, I think, Demetra George's book, she opens with that, that is Fallon's passage about like how astrology is like, learning astrology is like you're climbing this really tall mountain, and you climb and climb and climb, and it just is just mountain. And then you get to the top, and there's this like gorgeous temple there. And it's like, I finally arrived at this place, and now I understand. And I think that just perfectly like encapsulates it,
Yes. The sense of
so
recognition, perhaps. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and that it's not this like kind of frivolous art form that you just kind of like dip your toes in and think you completely understand.
That's
Um,
right.
it is this thing that really takes time and experience and growth and maturity, and the wisdom that you gain through all of that.
That's
Yeah.
right. It is kind of a divine gift. So just like in the analogy that you described, right? It's a temple.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. So thinking back to that period that you were going through, back when you went to Chani Nicholas's workshop, what did you feel was kind of the switch in your thinking, if you can describe that? Like it sounds like maybe beforehand you were kind of thinking, well, this is just kind of suffering. Will this go on forever? Like what was, if you can talk about that specifically, what was the realization for you, or what do you feel astrology kind of helped you see differently?
That's a really, really great question. What's really interesting for me, oddly, was that I used to teach art, at Cal Arts, I taught animation. And, once you go through that kind of experience, it is very challenging to try to teach art because every artist is unique and individual and they
Hmm.
don't all need the same lesson. And, you know, you might teach a class, but if there are like 40 students in that class, it's going to be understood in 40 different ways. It's not the same for everyone. But at
Yeah.
the same time, you want some kind of uniform truths or wisdom that you present to the students. But understanding astrology, and especially the aspect about like, no two charts are the same unless they were born obviously in this exact same moment in that exact same time. um, I think that really reframed my mind into really recognizing the autonomy of every human being, and kind of helped me, I don't know, let go of this idea even more so that everyone kind of has to be the same, and like there needs to be this uniformity that's applied to every person, and especially every artist. And I think that was really liberating. It also, I think, helped me kind of embrace my own unique challenges as my own thing that nobody else is experiencing. And I think
Hmm.
there's something very freeing about that, and empowering in an odd way. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
No, you really are. You really are. It's, I think a lot of what goes on too is that, as you just said, all artists have their own process, right? And so I can
Mhm, mhm.
imagine that being a professional artist like yourself, it's probably very difficult not to compare your own career trajectory with that of other people, or your creative output volume with that of other people. And
Mhm.
so I can imagine that maybe, as you said, every chart is different and every person is different. It's maybe eye opening to see that, you can really go about things your own way and you can kind of develop at your own pace.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, that's really cool. So I guess this sort of leads into my next question, which was, how has astrology been helpful to you in your field of work as a creative artist? So, all right, so you went to the workshop, you're starting, maybe it's been a year or so. Has it, informed kind of your process or even the content of your work? Like, do you feel like something has changed in terms of your actual output, or the way that you go about creating art?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think definitely working with creatives or artists through astrology is kind of what I aspire to be in terms of the astrological field. Like I do want to be an astrologer that works with creatives and artists to help realize their voice and, express their artwork. And because, creating art is a process, it takes time. Anything that is procedural, has direct connections to, astrology and time and seasons. I mean, even like the most basic example being, for example, like let's say like Saturn is going through the midheaven or the third house or like the fifth house of an artist, that's most likely not going to be a time when that artist's it has like massive output of work. you know
Yes.
it's not going to be it's going to be more like a wintry hibernation where it's more about really sorting out internally like what do I want to say, and really figuring out, and it might be hard, and hard to it might be a time where you rethink how you express yourself. But as artists, it's really challenging for us not to compare ourselves with other artists. And when you see perhaps, let's say, someone else is going through like a Jupiter transit, through one of those like significators, they're probably going to be putting out a lot of work. And you might compare yourself and being like, what's wrong with me? What am I not doing correctly? And even, negate your own artistic voice in that process.
Hmm.
And I feel like when you see the transits that you're going through, because it contextualizes everything, it almost kind of gives you the permission to be like, oh, no, no, this is not a time necessarily when you're supposed to just be like having a party with your art. It's really a time you are supposed to be more introspective and sort through your priorities. And even just something as simple as that, I think when people hear that and there is a recognition of, their quote unquote like artistic suffering, I think that's hugely liberating too. But also, a person's chart, I think, we've heard this a lot, but like a person's chart is so directly tied in so many ways to the art that they create, so even for people who might feel like they've they don't know what they want to create, or they don't have a direction, or they don't have a style, or they don't have a vision, sometimes a lot of those answers on why they might feel that way, but also what those solutions might be, also might be in like the natal chart. And yeah, I just think that's a really fascinating venue to explore.
There's so much there, Minkyu, for sure.
Yeah, and it's like, I think we talked about this earlier in one of our conversations, but like, remember when, like, right after I watched Midsummer and I asked you, like, is watching horror movies remediation?
I remember that very well, yes.
In a weird way, like, I think there's a part of me that, like, wonders, for example, I'm just like collecting a lot of like artist charts that I really look up to. And I notice, if we, let's say, broadly, because, Venus rules the arts, like Venus as a significator of the arts, you would think like,
Sure.
oh, Venus is really well placed. But, um, I was noticing that a lot of my favorite artists have Venus in Aries, which technically is her detriment. But, for example, like Sofia Coppola, Michel Gondry, Wes Anderson, all these directors that I love have Venus in Aries, and it was really interesting seeing. So something like that in a natal chart, you might be able to help that artist like point out like what is the expression of this Venus that might be more compatible to your voice, which
Yes.
in that case I can definitely see like a common thread of how Venus expresses herself in those artists. You see that kind of very beauty first, like that very like self-inserting kind of sense of beauty, where it's like beauty to the forefront. Like
Yes.
it's this very unapologetic vision of beauty. Like I especially think of Wes Anderson. It's like beauty for beauty's sake type of
Yes.
thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say I could totally see that Venus in Aries, right? Because he has a certain style. And as you said, it's completely unapologetic. And it's like, nope, here's a Wes Anderson movie and a Wes Anderson visual.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
it's same with Coppola too. And
Yes.
one of the best artists of history, Michelangelo had Venus in
Hmm.
Aries. So when you
Right.
see his work, it's just this proud, very like I am here and I am beautiful type thing.
Yes. Yes.
And what's so interesting too, like I think someone like George Miller, who directed Mad Max and
Hmm.
most recently the Marvel Mad Max Fury Road. I think that's another you know, astonishing, very literal example of, something like Venus in Aries, where it's this vision of like war, Fury Road. But when you
Yes.
watch the movie, it's just, again, this completely unapologetic vision of like all out beauty,
Hmm.
even when you have these like post apocalyptic tribes that are self mutilating and trying to destroy each other. I mean, you just cannot take your eyes off of it because it's so beautiful. And so
Yes.
I think discovering those things and maybe even helping other artists who, obviously these artists that we mentioned have such a prominent voice. Again, maybe probably that's the Venus and Aries, but they just are
Hmm.
so sure of their identity. But there might be some other artists who are not, or who are in that season of trying to find themselves. And it just seems like, astrology can be in that way such a helpful tool.
Yes. No, that's
Yeah.
a great point. And wow, you covered a lot of ground. But so I made some notes. So hopefully we can. I wanted to reference a few things you
Yes,
said though.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So in my last month in my Patreon Q&A, one of the things our group ended up talking about was what kind of art do you enjoy or make depending on the sign that your Venus is in.
Oh,
And one
interesting.
of the,
Yes.
and yeah, I wish you had been there. That would have been really interesting to hear it from your perspective, since obviously
Mm.
you have made a study of this. And one of the things that we concluded is that Venus in fire signs tends to be extremely, extremely visual more than anything.
Oh, amazing. Yeah.
Because fire, of course, represents light. And, that the sun
Mhm.
and even to a lesser degree, the moon, of course, is the reflected light. So, yeah, so it
Wow.
makes sense to me that film directors in particular, and I suppose perhaps photographers as well, and so on,
Mhm.
would have Venus in a fire sign. It just,
Yeah.
the motion, the light, a lot of it just makes sense to me.
Yeah, totally. And it's such a kind of like cathartic, empowering version of like Venus in her detriment. I just love
Exactly.
those things. And, even as
Exactly.
something as, again, like this is another example of maybe something that one might look at in an astrological chart and not think of as like a great significator or possibly even like a negative aspect. But I've also noticed, a lot of my favorite artists have their moon very tightly conjunct their Saturn. And,
Mm,
I'm thinking of like Donald Judd, Agnes Martin, James Turrell,
mhm.
these artists who are amazing at like minimalism, just like really trimming everything down into like the essence of something,
Yes.
because I do think the moon is also kind of a significator of art because, obviously the moon connects to the material and the material body. And it's that kind of like process of like putting into form, something that's more
Yes.
real and yeah. So again, another example of something that might be like maybe in a natal chart, someone might be like, but as an artist, it's like, what a beautiful expression.
Right, right. And maybe the lesson there is that regardless of what's in your natal chart, if you can turn that into an artistic expression, no part of the chart is off limits or unhelpful, right? Like
Exactly.
everything can be utilized. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing that I'm kind of like discovering my studies too is like, yeah, sure, like, Venus is the ruler of the arts, but it really takes all the planets to create an artist.
Yeah.
It's not just Venus.
No, no. She's
Yeah,
perhaps the most visible, right? But as
yes,
just as you say, yeah.
yeah, but yeah, for Mars for the courage that it takes to be an artist, Uranus for the innovation and the ingenuity, and originality and stuff like that. So
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
really, really cool seeing that in artist charts.
Yeah, I mean, and I think too, I just wanted to kind of jump back to something you had initially said. And I think you had said this to me maybe the first time we met, something like that, like pretty early on.
Okay.
You told me that one of the things that you found really helpful as an artist and, kind of just getting into astrology is recognizing the concept of seasons in the sense of the seasons of the
Mhm.
life, right? Just as you were saying earlier, that there, it can't be summer and spring forever, right? But you have
Yeah,
to go
totally.
through a period of sort of mental or creative composting and perhaps a mental and creative hibernation. And that's not only okay, it's desirable and it's natural.
Yeah, you can actually make the most out of a challenging situation if you can contextualize it in that journey, in that longer story of like, oh, this is why this is needed.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to make sure I said that because I thought you had said that so wonderfully. And it's, on the one hand, it's very simple, but it's also a very profound truth about astrology and the cyclicality of it. And I think, it's an element of astrology that helps people cope with difficult periods because you realize nothing lasts forever, not the good, not the bad. And it's
Yeah,
just all part of
everything.
a
Yeah,
larger cycle. Yeah.
everything is a season. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yes, precisely. Well, that's great. So let's jump forward a little bit, and I'd
Okay.
be interested to know about kind of what sparked your interest in astrological magic. How you made that leap from astrology into magic, which is the point at which you and I met.
Yeah. So, I think for me, I think a really big part of always trying to understand astrology is like trying to understand, how it works too, which of course is a futile attempt. No one knows how it works. But at the
Right.
same time, and not that I'm ever going to find out how it works, obviously not, but, I think the pondering of like how does this work is oddly enriching, I think, towards like
Hmm.
students who study astrology. Even though it's futile, it's like the pondering makes it more beautiful and it adds like
Yes.
enrichment to your understanding. And so I've just been really fascinated by the different kind of philosophical perspectives on that exact topic. And yeah, you probably know like the better terms for all these different branches of thought, but there are astrologers who just think that you know the planets are, you know they don't have their own will. They're just like, you know a spoke on a clock. They just
Right, like a
show us.
materialistic sort of philosophy, maybe.
Yeah, they don't dictate anything. They don't cause anything. And then obviously there's, and I'm sure, like, even in terms of the magical perspective of astrology, there's like different shades of nuance and spectrums of that too. But on the flip side, there's like the concept of the planetary rays that you introduced me to, and um, which is kind of like a slightly different perspective on that, and which makes it so more so that you can create these magical talismans or be more active in astrology. And so I think it was really a way, because I just wanted to experience it all, like the whole spectrum, to really shape my understanding of astrology even better in that way. Like, okay, I know what this other perspective is and I understand it. Like, what is this other perspective that I just want to investigate? And that kind of led me in there, which I think that's on one hand, but also on the other hand, I have Neptune very tightly conjoined by my midheaven.
Yes.
And I think that that is a very like wizardy aspect, in my opinion.
Yes.
Whenever I think of that, I think of Walt Disney has that aspect too. And when you think of like the most iconic Mickey, it's the Sorcerer's Apprentice Mickey, in my opinion.
This is
like,
true.
That's the thing that you see the most. And what's really interesting, obviously, Neptune, the midheaven animation, that makes sense, right? It's the illusion, the fantasy, and putting that up. But the Walt Disney Animation Studios in Burbank, when you go to that building, the front of the building has a sorcerer hat on it, and so I just look at that symbolism and I'm like, to me, that speaks of Neptune on the midheaven as well. And so I think part of it is just my, Neptune and midheaven.
Yes.
Of like, okay, what is magic? And, is it something that I should investigate and try to understand? And I think, so there's just this like natural pull, I think.
Yes.
Well,
I just recently watched an interview that Chris Brennan did with Robert Zoller, who died just a few months ago. And Robert Zoller was a traditional astrologer who did a huge amount of work in bringing a lot of these traditional texts to modern readers by translating them. And the thing about Robert Zoller was that in addition to being an astrologer, he had very clearly an interest and practice of magic. And, I don't think he was super forward about it, but I think he discussed it like in his course, and, he certainly wasn't hiding it. But the interesting thing that he had said that really stuck with me was that to him, astrology and magic were along the same continuum. And
interesting.
Yes. So he said, okay, well, astrology is sort of the analytical, left brain kind of part of the science. But then he said there has to be a counterpart as well on the right brain. And he said, I think magic is that counterpart. He said, really, it's really profound. I recommend listening to the interview. It's quite excellent.
Oh, now I will. Oh, I'm so excited. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And, it's for him, it's just this like almost a little aside, but it is quite profound. And you do realize that astrology and magic are sister arts or sciences. So, I'm not surprised that if you get into one, that the other perhaps might start to call you as well.
Oh yeah, I can totally see that. That was definitely the case for me. So wow, that's incredible. What a beautiful way to express that.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, all right. Well, that's pretty interesting. So one of the things too, I think with astrological magic is that, I don't know that you necessarily knew this when you started exploring it, but I imagine this probably interested you, is that astrological magic relies very heavily on images and talismanic images. And so one of the things that, of course, as an artist is a tremendous advantage is that you can create an aesthetically appealing version of a magical image. So for example, as you well know, the Venus image is a picture of a woman holding an apple in one hand and either a comb with some symbols or a mirror, depending on the source. And one of those things, again, we have historic talismans, and usually they're not that aesthetically attractive because, most people who wrote these kinds of manuscripts were not professional artists by a long shot.
Right.
So
But then
luckily
even
the
that
talismans, what's that?
I was going to say, but even that kind of is charming, in
It
its own
is.
way.
It is.
These
Oh, it is.
old
I mean, it's
manuscript
cute.
drawings.
It
Yeah.
is cute.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
And they all
yeah.
have like their little, and,
Yeah.
and then in some cases we have seen talismans that are, pretty old. For example, ones that are related to the Greek magical papyri, which are, of course, from about 2,000 years ago. And then you see those drawings, and it's kind of like a 3-year-old was just handing a crayon, So, and I don't know if those talismans worked because we don't
Mhm.
know what the result was. But at the same time, like it doesn't have to be beautiful, but on the other hand, it certainly helps, right? If it's aesthetic, there is this concept in astrological magic that the rays from the object hit the eye and from there enter
Mhm.
the soul. And so the more
Mhm.
attractive the object, the more you will want to gaze at it and therefore commune with its energy.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, if you ask me, it's much better to have anything more beautiful.
Yes. Oh, yeah, exactly. Right. Especially if
Yeah.
you'll have it in front of you all the time. And yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
All right. So that leads me to my next question then.
Okay.
So obviously you've been making talismanic images for magic collections for a few months now. And so I'd be interested to know what kind of process has it been, kind of how do you sort of approach the image? Usually what I do is, I'll send you like a very short description of the magical image, but
Hmm.
not much more than that because I kind of don't want to influence you or push you in a particular direction. What's that like for you if you can describe how you go about it?
I mean, that's certainly so wonderful. I think that's what I'm learning from you is that, it can really be anything. There aren't like these really, really stringent rules upon what it needs to be as long as pictorially it equates to what the description is. And,
Yes.
you know, it's been a really invigorating learning process for sure. I think in the beginning I had an idea of what I wanted to do, but of course, the more you do it and the more discoveries you make, the vision changes and the idea expands and stuff. And but for me, I from a very micro level, part of what was really fun about it was just thinking of these planetary energies in visual material form, which is kind
Mhm.
of an abstract concept, but you know, they do manifest in material form, all of the planet's energies. And sometimes one of the ways that I found is kind of an interesting perspective into that is like basically, what does Venus look like? Well, what does someone with Venus on their ascendant look like? Because it's
Yes.
going to show in their body what that planetary energy is. Same with Mercury, same with Mars, all the planets. And so yeah, I remember one of the first elections that we created was the Venus and Taurus talisman. And,
Yep.
for me, so like my task was kind of like really looking into what is the material shape of Venus? What are the forms? What is the composition? And obviously, Venus on the ascendant, you know, the common idea, the basic idea is that they're going to be beautiful, right?
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, it's a certain kind of beauty, because beauty is not completely universal. There is a
Of
subjective
course.
angle to
Yeah.
beauty, and Venus does have, although she rules all of beauty, her in her purest form is a certain type of beauty. And I think it was Vedius Valens who said that people who have Venus rising have like an exceptionally calm demeanor too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you see like, for example, Beyonce or Angelina Jolie or Rihanna, the top three people mentioned whenever we talk about Venus rising,
Yes.
yes, they're very beautiful, but at the same time, it is a certain type of beauty. And especially, just taking Beyonce, for example, who has, if her chart is correct, remarkably exactly conjoined with her ascendant, um, she has that aura of calm,
Mm-hmm.
even if her presence and her voice is, that Mars in the midheaven, Sasha Fierce, queen, like fierce and just diva, like, the ascendant shape of her is very calm. And, I think we see that so well illustrated with that whole like Taylor Swift Kanye drama, you know, when Kanye called out like it was should have been Beyonce, single ladies that won the award. You know, what did she do? She did the most like Venus and Libra thing, which was like when it was time for her acceptance speech, she, you know, invited Taylor to give her acceptance speech because in her mind that was fair, you know. And
Yes.
so when I did the first Venus and Talisman drawing, like I wanted to depict more of that peace and balance, calm, harmonious aspect of Venus. And so, you know, the other thing about like Venus rising people is that they have very symmetrical faces, right? Because they have,
Mm-hmm.
because it's balance in the body, so their features are very harmonized, you know. So you know, I leaned into that, and I remember doing this very like symmetrical drawing of her holding like an apple and, you know, a comb. And your wonderful feedback to that was like, let's really, you know, kind of lean into the specific sign that Venus is in, which was Taurus. It wasn't Libra. And so that I was like, oh my God, of course. You know, and he was so right. So in the new iteration, I put her closer to the ground. And in terms of, you know, the rendering, this is a really interesting that I noticed about, you know, prominent Taurus placement natives to our artists is that, you know, because it is Venus in the material realm, it's Venus in an earth sign, they have like this exceptionally strong grasp on dimension. Like
Mm.
a lot of the best, you know, artists who can really think three-dimensionally, not abstractly, not in terms of like, you know, flowing emotion, but something as like a three-dimensional, like they can picture something as a three-dimensional object. That's, I think that's, you know, honestly, Venus in any of the earth signs or any, you know,
Mm-hmm.
earth signs tend to be able to have that. But especially Taurus, I think that's, you know, one of their beautiful gifts. And so I tried to, in that talisman, I remember trying to really dimensionalize the
Mm.
apple and the fig tree above her, because, you know, that's also a Venus signification. And so,
Yes.
yeah, it's just, I think that's how I started, you know, this experiment of like, how do I really, you know, pictorially describe these attributes that is of this abstract energy. And, you know, I mean, as a film director, that's also what I do. You know, when you think about what's on the screen in every scene, everything has a purpose, and everything that you place within the screen is a communication method. You know, it's a
Yes.
message. And so there's definitely very, very strong links there. And in that sense, it's been kind of like a really fun journey. But at the same time, you know, also the more that I draw, the more that I'm also wanting to find my own artistic voice within, you know, the art form of talisman creating, if that makes sense.
It
So I
makes
think
total
that's,
sense.
yeah, so I think that's going to be one of my biggest, I don't want to say challenges, because it's a lot more fun, but, you know, artistic
Your
fun challenge.
goal.
Yes,
Yeah.
my
Yeah,
goals.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, and one of the things that I really love is that we don't really have a lot of historic evidence, you know, for magical images done, one by top artists, but also ones that have a sense of individuality. You know, I think in general, when you do see magical images out there, it's kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, people tend to take it very seriously, but they don't place a lot of maybe fun or imagination into it, which I think is unfortunate because these images seem like they have so much life and potential. But I think in general, people tend to be so focused on, oh, you know, will I do it wrong if I personalize it, or if I, you know, if I kind of modify it in some degree. And so the result is, I think often you have seen, you know, kind of more just a certain stiffness to it, I think.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, one of the things that I've really appreciated about your approach and your art is that because you're coming at this from an animator, you know, animator's perspective, you know, I mean, literally animation is to give something soul. It's to give something life, right? Like anima, the
Yeah.
soul, right? And so that's what I really love about what you're doing is that you're giving it a lot of fun and a lot of dynamism,
Yeah.
which again
No,
is not something you really see in the magical image space, just really throughout its entire history.
wow. Well, thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say that. No, I do. like going back to what you said of like how the image, speaks to a person, like in my mind, it's always better if the image speaks more viscerally,
Yes.
and to some extent you could argue that that gives the image more power, when
Hmm.
it really speaks to you and you lock eyes to it. And so um yeah, I think imbuing the imitation of life, or kind of what you said, like the animated aspect, is I think it's a important part of why I draw. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and like I said, it's been really wonderful. So I feel very privileged for just
Oh
having
my
you
god, no, the
there to
privilege is
like
all
bring this to life. It's just such a wonderful dream come true. Um,
thank you. The
yeah,
feelings are
yeah, you're
mutual.
welcome. Yeah. So, all right. So, if you want, like I say, you don't have to answer, but I was curious if now that you've been, making images for a little bit, have you noticed any impact personally from creating magical images? And the reason I was wondering is even though you're not making the image at the talismanic moment, I can't help but wonder that drawing the magical image of Venus or of some other planet, I can't help but think that that would not inhabit your life or your soul in some way. Have you experienced that, or perhaps not yet?
It's interesting because it's exactly like you said. I didn't create any of these talismans in the moment that it's intended to be created, right?
Hmm.
But I do, in the moment that I am creating them, obviously I'm thinking about the planetary energies a lot. And so, it's hard to say.
Yeah. Yes.
um, I mean, it's like when I look at my reality right now, it's definitely not like the blessings aren't there. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
definitely not like, well, I created this Venus talisman, I created this Mercury talisman, even though they weren't timed or elected. But at the same time, it's like good things in those avenues are definitely, I feel like, happening to me. So
Hmm.
what can I say?
Yes.
It's one
Yes.
of those things where, you know, I don't know if it's okay to say, and please feel free to like edit it out. But we created that Venus talisman together, so I'm really excited to see. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
No, I'm
So
happy to actually talk about this because I'm hoping. So just for everyone, so Minkyu and I, well, Minkyu did the actual hard work. I just timed this and I did the magical ritual around it. But Minkyu created an astrologically timed Venus and Taurus talisman. It's a beautiful image of Venus and Taurus. And the thing we still have to do, I think, when we get our permission to congregate again here in California,
yes,
Minkyu has to sign each of these images. So he made a set of, I believe it's 10, I want to say. And then we're going to place them up for sale. But of course, Minkyu is going to get a copy and Nina's going to get a copy. And so we're both very interested to see once these are kind of finalized and once you kind of do your own personalization ritual, kind of what the effect is going to be, especially on someone like Minkyu, who is an artist. And, he is looking for, I think, more Venusian influences in his life.
yes.
Is that okay
All
to say that? Okay.
yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. I think you know all the planetary influences, I think, have a good form, and who wouldn't want that?
Yes, yes, exactly. So
Yeah,
something to look forward to. Yes, absolutely.
and
Um,
more to come,
yeah.
right?
Yes, that's my hope as well. I think there's some really interesting opportunities. So yeah, I think it'll be quite good.
Yeah.
All right. So do you have any personal magic stories so far that you'd like to share, or is it just too early in your magical development?
Yeah, I think I do feel like the honest answer would be that it's a little early to have kind of like an amazing story just yet, but
Mhm.
you know, um, excited to find out.
Exactly. Once we give you that talisman and put it on your wall, Minkyu, then you'll have
Okay,
stories,
yeah,
I'm sure.
it's over. Yeah.
Suddenly you're like, Nina, why do I have this like incredibly active social life? Now I can't get any work done. Thanks.
Yes. Why did I wake up with long flowing blonde hair? No, just kidding.
Yeah, it's like I don't remember how I got there, but I mean I like
Yeah.
it.
gosh, hilarious.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you very much, Minkyu. This has been such a pleasure, and I'm sure I'll have you on in a few months again when maybe we've worked on some more projects and there's more to tell. But
Oh
this is
yes,
just a wonderful intro, yeah, for all the listeners. So thank you
oh,
for
the
being here.
pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and learn from you, and so thank you.
All right. Thank you, Minkyu. Thank you, Minkyu. Thank you, Minkyu. Thank you, Minkyu. Thank you, Minkyu.
That is it for this episode of Magical Elections. My name is Nina Griffin, and I welcome your comments and questions. You can reach me at ninagriffin.com, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and of course, Instagram. I wish you a magical June.